They say loyalty is a two-way street. What they don't tell you is that in corporate America, it's usually a dead end, one where you keep walking forward while they've already turned around and left. I learned that in a conference room on the 32nd floor, where the view of the city was supposed to make you feel important, and the leather chairs were supposed to make you feel comfortable while they gutted your compensation and called it strategic realignment. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, casting long shadows across a table, where three people were about to explain why 9 years of exceptional performance was worth exactly 28% less than it had been worth the day before. My name is Rebecca Torres, and I used to be the Senior Director of Business Development at Ashford & Partners, one of the most prestigious management consulting firms in the Northeast. Used to be, because that afternoon in that conference room, I learned that the relationships I'd built, the revenue I'd generated, and the reputation I'd created were apparently worth less than whatever number made the quarterly projections look better to people who'd never closed a deal in their lives. The meeting had been called for 3 o'clock. No agenda, just compensation discussion in the calendar invite, which should have been my first warning. In 9 years at Ashford, I'd never had a compensation discussion that wasn't tied to performance reviews or promotions. Random meetings about money in the middle of Q3 meant something was wrong. I'd prepared anyway, pulled my numbers, reviewed my accounts, assembled the data that proved what I already knew, that I was the top revenue generator in the business development division for 7 of the past 9 years, that my client relationships represented over $40 million in annual billings, that the firm's reputation in financial services consulting was built substantially on work I'd brought in and relationships I'd maintained. The numbers were unambiguous. Whatever this meeting was about, I was walking in with evidence of my value. What I didn't have was evidence of my leverage. That would come later. Marcus Ashford sat at the head of the table, third-generation owner of the firm his grandfather had founded, 53 years old. The kind of man who'd grown up knowing he'd run this company and had never quite developed the skills that would have been required if he'd had to earn the position. He wore his authority like an inherited suit. It fit, but it didn't quite belong to him. Beside him sat Patricia Chen, our CFO, whose job was to make numbers tell whatever story leadership wanted told, and David Rothstein, head of HR, whose presence at any meeting was a reliable indicator that something unpleasant was about to be framed as something reasonable. "Rebecca," Marcus said. And he used my first name, like we were friends, like we hadn't spent 9 years in a relationship defined entirely by how much money I made for his family's firm. "Thank you for making time for this conversation." I hadn't made time. He'd taken it, the way executives always take time from the people who work for them, treating calendars as requests rather than realities. "I want to start by acknowledging your contributions to Ashford & Partners," he continued. "Your work over the past 9 years has been exceptional. The relationships you've built, the revenue you've generated, it's been noticed and appreciated." The past tense again, that verbal tick that executives develop when they're about to do something they don't want to take responsibility for. "We're entering a period of strategic transformation," Patricia said, picking up the script. "The consulting industry is evolving, and Ashford needs to evolve with it. Part of that evolution involves restructuring our compensation models to align with market realities and firm-wide strategic priorities." Market realities. Another phrase that meant nothing and everything, nothing specific enough to argue with. Everything implied about forces beyond anyone's control that just happened to require paying people less. "What does that mean for my compensation specifically?" I asked. Because I'd learned long ago that the only way to get through corporate euphemism was to force people to say what they actually meant. Patricia slid a folder across the table. Inside was a single sheet of paper with numbers on it. My current compensation, my proposed new compensation, the percentage change between them. 28% reduction. I looked at the number for a long moment, making sure I understood what I was seeing. My base salary, cut by nearly a third. My bonus structure, modified in ways that made the targets harder to hit, and the payouts smaller when you hit them. My equity participation, eliminated entirely in favor of a profit-sharing pool that would be distributed at leadership's discretion. "You're cutting my compensation by 28%, I said, not a question. "We're restructuring your compensation to align with the new model," David said. "All senior directors are being transitioned to this framework. It's not a reflection of your performance. It's a firm-wide initiative. All senior directors are taking 28% cuts?" Silence, the kind that answers questions more honestly than words. "The specific adjustments vary based on role and function," Patricia said carefully. "Your adjustment reflects the new structure for business development positions." So business development is being cut more than other functions. Business development compensation has historically been weighted toward variable components tied to individual revenue generation. The new model emphasizes team-based performance and firm-wide profitability. Translation: they were cutting commissions on client relationships and replacing them with discretionary bonuses that leadership would control, taking the direct connection between my work and my pay and inserting themselves as gatekeepers who could reward loyalty over performance. I generated $42 million in revenue last year, I said. My compensation was approximately 4% of that. You're proposing to reduce it to under 3%, while simultaneously making it discretionary rather than formula-based. The new model is designed to create alignment across the firm, Marcus said. We've found that individual revenue incentives can sometimes work against collaborative culture. The adjustments are about building a more cohesive organization. I looked at him, at his inherited office and his inherited title, and his inherited assumptions about how the world worked. My clients come to Ashford because of relationships I built with them personally, I said. They trust me. They've followed me through 3 different service offerings and 2 industry downturns. If I leave, most of them leave with me. The temperature in the room dropped. I watched Marcus's expression shift from rehearsed sympathy to something harder, more alert. Client relationships are firm assets, David said, the HR playbook emerging. Any suggestion that clients would follow individual employees raises concerns about fiduciary duty and non-compete obligations. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating a fact. You can verify it by calling any of my top 20 clients and asking whether they're working with Ashford and Partners or working with Rebecca Torres. That sounds like a threat, Marcus said. It sounds like information you should have before you make decisions about my compensation. I've spent 9 years building relationships that generate $40 million annually for this firm. If you want to pay me 28% less for that work, you should understand what you might be risking. Patricia glanced at Marcus, a quick look that communicated something I couldn't read. Perhaps we should take a step back. This is a lot to absorb, and we want to make sure you have time to review the full proposal before making any decisions. What decisions are there to make? You've presented a compensation structure. Am I meant to negotiate, or is this final? The framework is final, Marcus said. The implementation details have some flexibility. We're open to discussing how the transition is managed, but not whether it happens. The strategic direction has been set by the partnership. This isn't something that's open for individual negotiation. I closed the folder, set it on the table between us. The afternoon sun had shifted while we talked, the shadows growing longer across the polished wood. I need time to consider my options, I said. Of course, David said, relief evident in his voice. Take a few days, review the materials. We're happy to schedule a follow-up conversation once you've had a chance to process everything. I don't need a few days. I need until the end of the week to decide whether I'm going to accept a 28% pay cut or pursue other opportunities. We'd prefer to have this resolved quickly, Marcus said. The new compensation structure goes into effect at the start of next quarter. We need to have everyone's agreements in place before then. Next quarter starts in 6 weeks. You'll have my answer by Friday. I stood, gathered my things, and walked out of that conference room into an afternoon that felt different than it had an hour before. The same city view through the same windows, but I was seeing it through the eyes of someone who'd just been told her value to the organization was worth exactly 28% less than she'd thought. My assistant Jennifer looked up as I passed her desk. She'd been with me for 6 years, knew my moods well enough to read them from a distance. Bad news? She asked quietly. We'll talk tomorrow. I need some time to think. I went back to my office, closed the door, and sat in the chair where I'd sat for 9 years, looking at walls covered with client photos and deal tombstones and the accumulated evidence of a career that apparently wasn't worth what I'd thought it was. The view from my window showed the city I'd built my professional life in, office buildings full of people like me, professionals who'd traded years of their lives for salaries and titles and the belief that their work mattered. How many of them had sat in conference rooms like the one I'd just left, being told their value had been recalculated and found wanting. The next 3 days were a careful exercise in parallel processing, doing my job during business hours while preparing for the possibility that I might not have that job much longer. I started with my employment agreement, reading it more carefully than I had when I'd signed it 9 years earlier. The non-compete clause was standard. 12 months, geographic limitations, industry restrictions that would make it difficult to work for direct competitors. But there were nuances I'd never noticed, exceptions I'd never considered, ambiguities that a good lawyer might be able to exploit. The client relationships clause was more interesting. Ashford claimed ownership of all client relationships developed during employment, but the language was vague about what that meant operationally. Did they own the relationship, or did they own the right to service accounts I'd brought in? There was a difference, and it wasn't clear the agreement addressed it. I called Sarah, a law school classmate who'd become an employment attorney specializing in executive departures. The non-compete is enforceable but narrow, she said after reviewing the documents. 12 months, specific geography, specific services. You couldn't work for a direct competitor doing the same work, but you could do related work for non-competitors or different work for competitors. What about the client? Relationships? That's murkier. They can claim ownership of accounts you developed while employed, but they can't prevent clients from choosing to work with you if you leave. Client choice is protected. They could try to sue for tortious interference if they could prove you actively solicited clients to leave, but if clients reach out to you independently, that's their decision. So, if I leave and clients follow me of their own accord, then Ashford has a business problem, not a legal claim. They might threaten litigation to discourage you, but they'd have a hard time winning if clients can testify that they chose to leave independently. I thought about my top 20 clients, about the dinners and calls and years of trust I'd built with people who relied on my judgment, who called me first when they had problems, who'd told me explicitly that they were working with me, not with Ashford and Partners. What if I had documentation showing that clients had expressed loyalty to me personally rather than to the firm? That would be helpful if it ever came to litigation. Notes from conversations, emails where clients specifically mentioned working with you, anything that establishes the relationship as personal rather than institutional. I had all of that. 9 years of careful documentation, because I'd learned early in my career that relationships without records were relationships that could be claimed by anyone. I had emails from clients thanking me specifically for my work. I had notes from conversations where executives had told me they'd follow me if I ever left. I had a paper trail that established, beyond any reasonable doubt, that my client relationships were mine, even if the contract said they belonged to Ashford. The question was whether I was willing to use it. Wednesday evening, I met with Margaret Sinclair, a former Ashford partner who'd left 3 years earlier to start her own firm. She'd built Sinclair Advisory into a boutique consultancy that competed with Ashford in several markets, and she'd done it by taking clients who'd wanted to follow her rather than stay with the firm. They threatened to sue me for 18 months, Margaret said, over drinks at a quiet bar far from the Ashford offices. Letters from their lawyers, calls to my clients warning them about contractual obligations, the whole intimidation playbook. Nothing ever came of it because they knew they'd lose. How did you know they were bluffing? Because I'd done exactly what you're doing now. I documented everything. I had emails from clients saying they were working with me, not with Ashford. I had records showing that my relationships predated my employment in some cases. When their lawyers reviewed my documentation, they realized that litigation would just create a public record of how badly Ashford had treated a top performer. What made you decide to leave? You were a partner. You had equity, voting rights, real ownership. They restructured the partnership compensation. Margaret smiled, the expression of someone recognizing a familiar pattern. Sound familiar? They cut the revenue-based components and increased the discretionary pool. Suddenly, my compensation was dependent on whether the managing partners liked me rather than whether I performed. 28%? 32%. I calculated that I'd be working harder for less money and less control. The math stopped making sense. And now I make twice what I made at Ashford, work with clients I actually like, and don't have to pretend that incompetent partners deserve their share of revenue I generated. The first year was hard. Cash flow was tight, and I was terrified that Ashford's threats would scare away clients. But by year 2, I was profitable. By year 3, I was hiring. Did you take a client list when you left? Margaret's expression sharpened. I didn't take anything that belonged to Ashford. No documents, no files, no confidential information. I just remembered who I'd worked with, remembered what their needs were, remembered the conversations where they'd told me they valued my judgment. And I made myself available if any of those people wanted to continue working with me. And they did. 12 of my top 15 clients moved within the first year, not because I asked them to, because they chose to, because the relationship was with me, not with the firm name on the door. I thought about my own top 15 clients, about the dinners and golf games and conference calls that had built trust over nearly a decade, about the executives who'd told me explicitly that I was the reason they worked with Ashford, that the firm's brand meant nothing compared to the relationship we'd built. What would you do in my position? I asked. I'd leave. Not because of the money, though the money matters, but because of what the compensation change tells you about how they see you. They're not cutting your pay because the firm is struggling. They're cutting it because they can, because they think you won't leave, because they've decided that your loyalty is worth more to them than your compensation. That calculation only works if you prove them right by staying. And if I leave, then you prove them wrong. You take your relationships, your reputation, your expertise, and you build something where your value is recognized rather than extracted. It's not easy, nothing good is, but it's possible. I'm proof of that. I thought about her words on the drive home, about 9 years of building something I was proud of, only to be told it was worth 28% less because someone had decided to test my tolerance for disrespect. About the clients who trusted me, who'd told me explicitly that they were working with me, not with the firm. About the possibility that those relationships might be worth more outside of Ashford than inside. The fear was real. Leaving meant giving up certainty, the steady paycheck, the established infrastructure, the comfort of knowing what each day would bring. Starting something new meant risk at a level I hadn't faced since the early days of my career, when I had less to lose and more time to recover. But staying had risks too. The risk of accepting diminished value, of establishing a precedent that I could be pushed around, of spending years watching the gap between my contributions and my compensation grow wider. The risk of looking back at this moment and wishing I'd had the courage to make a different choice. I finished my drink, looked out the window at the city lights, thought about 9 years of work and what they'd been worth. I'm going to need some time to think, I said. Take the time you need, but Rebecca, don't take too long. The longer you stay after they've shown you who they are, the harder it becomes to leave. Inertia is a powerful force, and they're counting on it. She was right about that too. Every day I stayed was another day of normalization, another day of accepting the diminished terms, another day of proving them right about my willingness to be undervalued. Thursday, I made my decision. Friday morning, I walked into Marcus Ashford's office and told him I was declining the new compensation structure and resigning from Ashford & Partners effective in 2 weeks. His reaction was interesting, not surprise exactly, but something like frustrated recognition, the look of someone who'd hoped a gamble would pay off and was realizing it hadn't. I'm disappointed to hear that, he said. I'd hoped we could find a way to make this work. You could have made it work by not cutting my compensation by 28%. You chose not to. The restructuring affects everyone, Rebecca. It's not personal. Everything's personal when it's your livelihood. You made a calculation that I'd accept less money rather than face the uncertainty of leaving. You calculated wrong. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You've been a valuable member of this firm for 9 years. I hate to see it end this way. It didn't have to end this way. You made a choice about my compensation, and I'm making a choice about my future. Both choices have consequences. I want to be clear about our expectations regarding client relationships. His tone shifted, becoming harder, more formal. The collegial regret was gone, replaced by the legal posturing that I'd expected. Any attempt to solicit Ashford clients will be met with legal action. The non-compete and client relationship clauses in your agreement are enforceable, and we will enforce them. I'm aware of my contractual obligations. I don't intend to solicit anyone. If clients choose to reach out to me after I've left, that's their decision. We'll be monitoring the situation closely. I'm sure you will. I'd expect nothing less from a firm that treats its top performers as expendable and then threatens them when they decline to be expended. That's not fair, Rebecca. This was a business decision. Fairness has nothing to do with it. You decided my work was worth 28% less than you'd been paying for it. I disagreed. The market will determine which of us was right. The next 2 weeks were strange, the liminal space between belonging somewhere and not belonging anywhere. I came to the office, attended meetings, continued working on active projects. But everyone knew I was leaving, and that knowledge changed every interaction. Some colleagues avoided me, as if departure were contagious. Others sought me out, asking quiet questions about my plans, about whether I thought they should be worried too, about what the compensation restructuring meant for the firm's future. I gave what guidance I could without saying anything that might be used against me later. I spent my last 2 weeks documenting transitions, briefing colleagues on active projects, and being scrupulously careful not to do anything that could be construed as solicitation. I didn't take any client lists. I didn't need to, because the relationships were in my head, built over years of personal connection. I didn't download confidential documents or copy proprietary methodologies. I left with nothing except my personal effects, my reputation, and the knowledge that I'd handled my departure with integrity even when the firm hadn't earned that consideration. Jennifer, my assistant, cried when I told her I was leaving. She'd been with me since my 3rd year at Ashford, knew my clients almost as well as I did, had been my operational partner in everything I'd built. "What will I do?" she asked. "You'll continue doing excellent work for whoever they assign you to, and when I'm settled somewhere, if you want to join me, there might be a place." "Really? Really, I couldn't have done any of this without you. If I'm building something new, I want you to be part of it." She was the first person I hired when Torres Advisory was stable enough to support a full-time administrative role, and she brought her own network of relationships with her, the executive assistants and office managers at client companies who coordinated meetings and knew whose calls got returned and whose didn't. Those relationships mattered more than most people realized, and my phone, which started ringing before I'd even cleaned out my desk. The first call came from David Chen, CFO of Meridian Financial, one of my largest clients. "I heard you're leaving," he said. "When can we talk about continuing to work together?" "I haven't landed anywhere yet. I'm taking some time to figure out next steps." "Whatever you figure out, I want to be part of it. We've worked together for 7 years. You understand our business better than anyone at Ashford. That relationship is with you, not with them. I appreciate that. I'm not able to discuss anything specific while I'm still employed here, but I'll reach out once I've made decisions about what's next." Similar calls came throughout the week. Executives I'd worked with for years, reaching out unprompted, making clear that their loyalty was to me personally. By the time I walked out of Ashford for the last time, I had informal commitments from 8 major clients. Not solicited, just offered, because the relationships I'd built were strong enough to survive a change in institutional affiliation. The next 6 months were simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. I didn't join another firm. Margaret's story had convinced me that building something of my own was worth the risk. Instead, I formed Torres Advisory, a boutique consultancy focused on the financial services clients I knew best. Small team, low overhead, compensation directly tied to value delivered rather than filtered through partnership politics. The early days were harder than I'd anticipated. Setting up the legal structure, finding office space, building the operational infrastructure that larger firms take for granted, all of it required time and attention that I wanted to spend on client work. I'd been a rainmaker at Ashford, not an entrepreneur, and the skills didn't translate as smoothly as I'd hoped. Cash flow was terrifying. I'd taken on a lease for a small office, hired an administrative assistant, invested in technology and marketing. The money was going out before much was coming in, and every week I checked the balance in the business account with a mixture of determination and dread. But the clients came. Slowly at first, then faster as word spread, that I was available and that my firm could deliver the same quality of work that I'd delivered at Ashford, without the overhead and politics that came with a large partnership. Ashford's lawyers sent cease and desist letters, as Margaret had predicted, threatening language about non-compete violations and tortious interference, demands that I stop soliciting clients who'd come to me on their own initiative. Each letter was more aggressive than the last, escalating the rhetoric about legal consequences and professional reputation damage. I forwarded everything to Sarah, who responded with polite, detailed letters explaining why each claim was legally baseless and inviting Ashford to proceed with litigation if they believed they had a case. She was magnificent, calm, thorough, citing case law that established the principles I was relying on: the right of clients to choose their advisors, the distinction between solicitation and availability, the limits of non-compete enforcement when the employee isn't competing directly, but rather offering different services to the same market. "They're trying to scare you," Sarah said during one of our calls. "The letters are designed to make you nervous, to make you think twice about accepting client work, to create enough uncertainty that you'll hesitate. Don't let them." "What if they actually sue?" "Then we litigate and we probably win. But they won't sue because suing would require them to make specific claims about specific clients. And they don't have evidence of solicitation because you haven't solicited anyone. They're bluffing with a weak hand." She was right. The letters kept coming for about 4 months, then stopped. I assumed someone had finally done the cost-benefit analysis and realized that suing a former employee for having good client relationships would generate worse publicity than it was worth. Or maybe they'd consulted with their own lawyers and been told what Sarah had been telling me, that they didn't have a case, just grievances. By month 6, Torres Advisory was profitable. Not dramatically profitable. I was paying myself less than I'd made at Ashford, even with the 28% cut. But the trend line was clear. Revenue was growing, expenses were stable, and the gap between them was widening in the right direction. The turning point came in month 8, when I landed the first major engagement that I couldn't have won at Ashford: a financial services company that had been resistant to working with large consultancies that valued the personal attention and specialized expertise that a boutique firm could offer. They'd heard about Torres Advisory through the network, had reached out to explore whether I could help with a strategic initiative they were planning. The engagement was worth $500,000 over 6 months. More importantly, it proved that I could win new business, not just retain old relationships. That Torres Advisory wasn't just a vehicle for clients who would have worked with me anywhere. It was a genuine competitive option in the market. By month 12, I'd hired 3 consultants and was turning away work I didn't have capacity to handle. By month 18, I was making more than I'd made at Ashford. Not just more than the reduced compensation they'd proposed, but more than I'd ever made there, because I was capturing the full value of my relationships rather than splitting it with partners who contributed nothing except the family name. The mathematics were simple once you laid them out. At Ashford, I'd generated $40 million in client revenue and received about 4% as compensation. At Torres Advisory, I was generating less revenue, about $12 million in the first full year, but capturing a much higher percentage. The net result was higher income despite lower gross revenue, because I wasn't subsidizing partners who'd never closed a deal in their lives. The client list that I'd supposedly left with wasn't a document or a database. It was a network of relationships, built over 9 years, that chose to follow me because I'd earned their trust. 12 of my top 15 Ashford clients moved their business to Torres Advisory within the first year. Not because I asked them to, I was careful never to make the first move, but because they preferred working with me to working with whoever Ashford assigned to replace me. The conversations with those clients were revealing. Almost every one of them said some version of the same thing. We were working with you, not with Ashford. The firm's name on the door never mattered to us. David Chen at Meridian Financial put it most bluntly. Ashford sent some partner I'd never met to continue the relationship. He spent our first meeting talking about the firm's credentials and capabilities. You never did that. You spent our first meeting asking about our problems and how you could help solve them. That's the difference. That's why we're here. It was the difference, and Ashford had never understood it. They'd treated client relationships as institutional assets, transferable commodities that could be reassigned from one professional to another based on internal convenience. They'd been wrong, and the evidence was walking out their door and into my office. Marcus Ashford called once, about 8 months after I'd left. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. "We've lost several significant accounts since your departure," he said, as if this were news to me, as if I hadn't been the one receiving those accounts. "I want to discuss whether there's a path to collaboration." "What kind of collaboration?" "Referrals, partnerships, ways we can work together rather than against each other." "You threatened to sue me for 8 months. You sent letters to my clients warning them about legal consequences for working with me. Now you want to collaborate?" The legal posturing was perhaps excessive. I'm prepared to acknowledge that we could have handled your departure differently. You could have not cut my compensation by 28%. That would have been handling it differently. Silence. Then, the restructuring was a firm-wide decision. It wasn't directed at you personally, but I took it personally because it affected my personally, and now you're experiencing the consequences of that decision. I'm not interested in collaborating with Ashford. I'm interested in building something better. I hung up. Never spoke to him again. 2 years after leaving, Torres Advisory had grown to 12 consultants and was generating annual revenue that would have made me one of Ashford's top 3 rainmakers. Except now, I was keeping the margin instead of sharing it with partners who'd valued my work at 28% less than it was worth. The irony wasn't lost on me. By trying to extract more value from my compensation, Ashford had lost access to my value entirely. The $40 million in annual revenue I'd been generating was now going to my firm, my team, my vision of what consulting could be, when the people doing the work actually captured the rewards. I ran into Patricia Chen at an industry conference about 3 years after my departure. She'd left Ashford too, pushed out in another round of restructuring that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with partnership politics. "You were right to leave," she said over coffee in a quiet corner of the conference hall. "The compensation changes were the beginning, not the end. They've restructured twice more since then. Each time, the people who generated the most value got cut the most because they were expensive. As if expense and value weren't connected. How bad is it? They've lost market share every year since you left. The financial services practice you built is a shadow of what it was. Most of your clients followed you, and the ones who stayed are slowly transitioning away because the relationships were never with the firm. I didn't take those clients, they came to me. I know, everyone knows, But that doesn't change the outcome. You were the relationship, and when you left, the relationship left with you. Ashford is still pretending that client relationships are firm assets, but the evidence says otherwise. She paused, stirring her coffee. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you ever regret it? Not leaving? I know you don't regret that. But the way it happened. The conflict, the legal threats, the burned bridges. I thought about that question, about the conference room where they'd told me I was worth 28% less, about the months of threatening letters and posturing, about the relationships that had been professional and were now adversarial. I regret that it was necessary, I said finally. I wish they'd recognized my value while I was there, rather than after I'd left. I wish the compensation conversation had been a negotiation rather than an ultimatum. But given what they chose to do, I don't regret how I responded. They said, take 28% or leave. I left. That was the right choice. And the clients? The clients made their own choices. I didn't solicit them, didn't pressure them, didn't do anything except be available when they reached out. If they chose to follow me instead of staying with Ashford, that's because the relationships I built were worth more than the firm's institutional brand. That's not something I should apologize for. That's something Ashford should learn from. The conversation stayed with me for days afterward. Not because I had doubts about my decision, I didn't, but because it crystallized something I'd been thinking about since that afternoon in the conference room. The client list wasn't a document I'd stolen or a database I'd downloaded. It was years of trust, built one conversation at a time, one problem solved at a time, one relationship strengthened at a time. Ashford had never owned that. They'd just temporarily housed it, benefited from it, extracted value from it without understanding what it actually was. When they'd calculated my compensation at 28% less, they'd revealed how little they understood about where their revenue actually came from. They'd treated client relationships as interchangeable, transferable, institutional, something that existed independent of the people who'd built them. They'd been wrong, and the evidence of that wrongness was visible in their declining revenue and my growing firm. I think about that conference room sometimes, about Marcus Ashford's inherited authority and Patricia Chen's careful euphemisms and David Rothstein's HR-approved talking points, about the folder with the 28% cut laid out in clean typography, presented as if it were reasonable, inevitable, something I should simply accept because they had decided it was so. They said, take 28% or leave. I left with the client list, not as a document, but as a network of relationships that I'd built and they'd undervalued. Relationships that were worth more than the discount they'd tried to impose, that generated more revenue in my small firm than they'd generated in their large one. That proved what I'd always known, that value comes from people, not from institutions, and that people will follow trust wherever it goes. The street ran both ways after all. They'd just been driving in the wrong direction. 4 years after leaving Ashford, Torres Advisory was acquired by a larger consultancy at a valuation that made me financially independent for life. I stayed on as a partner, overseeing the integration, ensuring that the culture I'd built would survive the transition. The acquisition price was based substantially on client relationships, the network I'd assembled, the trust I'd earned, the revenue that flowed from years of personal connection. The relationships that Ashford had tried to claim as institutional assets turned out to be worth tens of millions of dollars when someone actually understood how to value them. I sent a brief note to Marcus Ashford after the acquisition was announced. Not to gloat, I'd moved past that, but because I thought he deserved to understand what his decision had cost. In 2019, you offered me a choice: accept 28% less or leave. I left. The relationships I'd built were acquired this week for a sum that significantly exceeds what Ashford's entire financial services practice is currently worth. I thought you'd want to know that client relationships are indeed valuable, just not in the way you assumed, he replied the next day. The response was brief, professional, devoid of the defensiveness I might have expected. Congratulations on your success. You were right, and I was wrong. I hope the lessons learned at Ashford's expense have benefited your career. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and I appreciated it more than I would have expected. Not because I needed his validation, I'd long since moved past needing anything from Ashford, but because it suggested that someone there had actually learned something from the experience. The lessons of those years continue to shape how I think about work, value, and the relationships that sustain careers. The first lesson is that compensation is communication. When a company cuts your pay, they're not just adjusting numbers. They're telling you something about how they see your value. The 28% reduction wasn't about market realities or strategic priorities. It was about Ashford believing they could pay me less without consequences, believing I would accept diminished compensation because leaving seemed harder than staying. They communicated, and I listened, just not in the way they intended. The second lesson is that relationships are portable even when contracts say otherwise. Ashford's lawyers claimed ownership of client relationships as firm assets. But relationships can't be owned. They can only be earned. The clients who followed me didn't do so because of legal technicalities or competitive dynamics. They followed because the relationship was with me personally, built over years of trust and results that had nothing to do with the name on the door. The third lesson is that courage is often cheaper than fear. Walking away from Ashford felt like an enormous risk at the time. Giving up a steady income, facing legal threats, building something from nothing in a market that already had established players. But staying would have had costs too. Diminished compensation, diminished respect, the slow erosion of knowing that I'd accepted less than I was worth because I was afraid to demand more. The fear of leaving kept me in that conference room, listening to their terms. The courage to leave built everything that came after. I think about the other people in that compensation restructuring sometimes. The ones who took the 28% cut because they had mortgages or families or fears that made leaving feel impossible. I don't judge them. Everyone's circumstances are different, and what was possible for me might not have been possible for them. But I wonder how many of them regretted staying. How many watched the firm continue to cut and restructure and extract value from people who'd given years of their careers? How many wish they'd had the leverage or the courage or the circumstances to make a different choice? The client list wasn't really a list. It was a career's worth of trust, accumulated one relationship at a time. Impossible to steal, because it lived in memories and handshakes and years of proving I was worth believing in. Some lessons are expensive. For Ashford and Partners, the lesson cost them $40 million in annual revenue and a market position they'd spent decades building. For me, it cost 2 years of uncertainty and risk and the fear that I'd made a terrible mistake. But I hadn't. I'd made the only decision that made sense once they'd shown me who they were. They'd said, take 28% or leave, and I'd left with the only thing that actually mattered, the relationships I'd built and the trust I'd earned. The street runs both ways after. They'd just been driving in the wrong direction, not realizing that the person they were trying to extract value from was the source of that value in the first place. They said, take 28% or leave. I left with everything that mattered, and I built something better with it. The city looks different now from the window of my new office, the one I earned and the company I built, surrounded by people who understand that value flows from relationships and relationships flow from trust. The old Ashford building is visible in the distance, a reminder of where I came from and why I left. Some mornings I look at it and feel gratitude, not for what they did. The compensation cut was never something to be grateful for, but for what it revealed, for the clarity that came from being told my worth and knowing with absolute certainty that they were wrong. They said take 28% or leave. I left with the client list that wasn't a list, and it turned out to be worth more than they ever understood.